It was one of those afternoons when the rain didn't pour. It simply lingered, like it had nowhere else to be. The cafe was quiet, a hum of soft conversations blending with the rhythmic tapping of raindrops against the glass. The kind of day that made you think about things you had been avoiding. I sat by the window, my tea cooling untouched, watching the world blur and refocus through streaks of rain. Across the street, 2 people laughed. A familiar laugh, one I used to know so well. It cut through the sound of rain, like a memory suddenly made real again. I turned instinctively, my heart recognizing before my eyes did. And there she was. Her posture, her smile. Everything about her was exactly as I remembered, yet entirely different. She laughed with the same warmth she once saved for me, but now it belonged to someone else. I watched without anger, without shock, just stillness. It wasn't betrayal that broke me. It was the quiet realization that I had been holding on to something that had already let go of me. The truth didn't arrive like lightning. It drifted in, soft, certain, and heavy. A message on my phone glowed faintly on the table. A half-hearted reply from her, promising to catch up soon. I looked back at the window, at her reflection in the glass, and realized soon was just another word for never. The tea had gone cold. Outside, the rain thickened, blurring the world until everything looked softer, kinder, as if mercy existed in not seeing clearly. I thought about how love, in all its forms, doesn't always leave through a door. Sometimes it simply fades out of focus. I could have walked outside. I could have waved, called her name, pretended I hadn't noticed the distance that had already settled between us. But I didn't. I just sat there, watching her laugh, the same way I once made her laugh, and felt something inside me quietly shift. It wasn't bitterness. It was something quieter, almost tender, the kind of ache that comes when you finally stop denying what's already true. I remembered every moment we had shared, every promise whispered in the warmth of girlhood, every night spent talking about dreams that felt too big for the world we lived in. And I wondered, not for the first time, if maybe I had been holding on to a version of her that no longer existed. The cafe felt smaller, the air heavier. I pressed my palm against the glass, tracing the outline of my reflection, blurred, almost dissolving into the rain. There she was again, behind me in the glass, laughing, carefree, untouched by the weight that pressed quietly on my chest. And in that reflection, I saw the truth. It wasn't that she had lied to me. It was that I had believed we were still the same. A strange calm filled me. A quiet understanding that this moment of stillness, was an ending disguised as an afternoon. I didn't need a confrontation. Some endings arrive without sound, without words, without goodbyes. The rain kept falling. People came and went, carrying umbrellas, coffee cups, brief smiles. The world was moving, but I wasn't ready to. Not yet. I looked out one last time. She was gone now, disappeared into the blur of umbrellas and passing cars, as if she had never been there at all. Only the echo of her laughter remained, fading into the hum of the cafe. I reached for my cup, took a sip of the cold tea, and let the bitterness settle on my tongue. It wasn't the tea that had gone cold. It was the space between us, the one that had been cooling for years without either of us noticing. As the rain fell a little harder, I realized something simple, something devastatingly human. Some goodbyes don't need words. They happen in silence, in the pause between 2 laughs, in the distance between 2 reflections. And sometimes, we don't lose people all at once. We lose them slowly, in the quiet moments when they stop looking back. The rain outside softened again, almost as if it understood. I gathered my things, stood up, and took one last glance at the window. My reflection looked different now. Blurred, yes, but lighter somehow. And in that blurred reflection, I saw it. The beginning of an ending I was finally ready to see. There was a time when the world felt smaller. Not because it had fewer places, but because we only needed one. It was the school courtyard, the one with the cracked pavement and the old neem tree that dropped its leaves like confetti every afternoon. We used to sit there, 2 girls with open notebooks and unguarded hearts, laughing about nothing and everything at once. The kind of laughter that left your ribs aching and your eyes glistening, not from sadness, but from the purity of being seen. It's strange how memory keeps certain sounds alive. The squeak of wet shoes after the rain, the chatter of classmates, the distant bell that always came too soon. Back then, it felt like life would always sound like that. Familiar, full, and soft around the edges. We had inside jokes that made no sense to anyone else, and promises we whispered like secrets we fully intended to keep. Forever felt so easy to say when we didn't yet understand what endings were made of. Sometimes, when I think back to those years, I don't see faces clearly anymore. Only feelings. The warmth of shared laughter, the quiet comfort of walking home side by side, backpacks swaying in rhythm, the way the world looked when it reflected in her eyes, bright, unbroken, endless. There was a purity to our friendship, untested by time, untouched by envy. She was the first person who made me feel understood without words. We didn't need to explain our silences. They were full of meaning on their own. Maybe that's what made it so special. The simplicity of connection before life became complicated. We used to dream about the future like it was something we could draw. We'd plan the houses we'd live in, the cities we'd move to, the lives we'd build, always side by side. Every someday had both our names written in it, and when she laughed, I believed her. There was a time when we thought growing up meant getting taller, not growing apart. We thought the world would wait for us, that our bond would be immune to distance, change, or choice. But even then, in the midst of our golden days, small shifts began. They started as little things, missed calls, shorter texts, the slow fade of everyday rituals. The jokes still landed, but the laughter didn't echo as long. The silences stretched wider. No longer comfortable, no longer full. Still, I told myself it was nothing, that the bond we had was stronger than time. I held on tighter, thinking love could anchor what life had already begun to drift. I kept showing up, kept waiting, kept believing, because that's what loyalty looked like to me, staying, even when the other person's heart had already begun to walk away. When I look back now, I realize how much of our friendship was built on me trying to preserve it. I was the one remembering the dates, sending the messages, keeping the flame alive. She was the one always just out of reach. Warm when she wanted to be, distant when it mattered most. But I didn't see it then, or maybe I refused to, because when you've built your world around someone, you mistake familiarity for forever. You think being needed once means being needed always. You think shared memories are a promise, not just proof of what used to be. There was one afternoon, I still remember the smell of wet earth after rain. We were sitting on the old bench behind the school, the air thick with humidity and unspoken words. She was talking about her new friends, people I didn't know, names I couldn't place. Her voice sounded excited but also far away. And in that moment, something inside me shifted. It was small, like the first drop of rain that warns of a storm. But I felt it. I smiled through it. I laughed when she laughed. But some part of me already knew. Our forever was quietly rewriting itself. Years later, when I replay that scene in my mind, it doesn't feel like a memory anymore. It feels like a photograph, still, beautiful, and haunting. Two girls frozen in laughter, unaware that one of them was already halfway gone. Still, I don't regret any of it. The warmth we shared, the safety we built, the love that once filled every corner of our lives. It was real. Even if it didn't last, it existed. And sometimes that's enough. I think that's the hardest part of growing up. Realizing that some of the people who shaped your heart were only meant to stay for a chapter, not the whole book. But when you're in it, you don't see the ending coming. You just keep holding on to the echo of laughter that once made everything make sense. Back when laughter meant forever. That's how I'll always remember us. Before time softened our edges and distance rewrote our story, before words turned cautious and silence became the language we spoke best. If I close my eyes, I can still hear her, the sound of her laugh, the one that used to fill the air like music. It doesn't hurt the way it used to. It just reminds me that once I had something pure enough to miss. Maybe that's what love and friendship really is. Not permanence, but the privilege of having been known so deeply, even for a while. And though we didn't keep every promise, the memory of that time still feels like a small light, the kind that doesn't fade, even when the room goes dark. Because some people don't stay forever, but they leave you with something that does. There's a certain silence that doesn't come from peace. It comes from knowing something has changed, but pretending it hasn't. That's where I found myself. In that strange space between what was and what was left of us. We still met sometimes, for coffee, for birthdays, for the sake of what used to be. We smiled for photos, laughed at old jokes, said all the right things, but behind every word there was an echo, a hollow ring where closeness used to live. She looked the same. Her hair, her clothes, her easy charm, everything I once admired was still there. But when she smiled, it no longer reached her eyes. It was polite, practiced, the kind of smile people wear when they've already left, but don't know how to say goodbye. I noticed it in small moments. The way she checked her phone while I spoke, the way she laughed a second too late, the way our conversations turned into summaries instead of stories. There were no more late-night calls, no more, "you won't believe what happened today." Just surface-level updates, thin layers of connection covering an emptiness neither of us dared to name. Maybe she thought I didn't notice. Maybe I wanted to believe I didn't, because sometimes it's easier to hold on to the illusion of closeness than to face the truth of distance. I remember one evening in particular. We were sitting at our usual cafe, the one by the corner window where the light always fell softly. The rain had just stopped, and people outside were walking fast, umbrellas closing like tired flowers. She was telling a story, something about work, about a trip she took with friends I didn't know. Her words moved easily, like a song she'd sung before, but her laughter, it sounded wrong. It wasn't the kind that filled the air between us. It floated above it, light, insincere, and as she laughed I realized how quiet I'd become. I wasn't part of her rhythm anymore, just an audience to a life I no longer belonged to. I looked at her and thought, this is what distance looks like when it wears a smile. There wasn't one single moment of betrayal. No harsh words, no final argument, no clear ending. It was more like a slow erosion, little grains of connection slipping away over time. And yet, somehow, that hurt even more. Because when someone leaves you suddenly, you have something to mourn. But when they fade slowly, you're left mourning in pieces, never sure which part of them disappeared first. I remember scrolling through old photos that night, the ones where our eyes sparkled with shared mischief, our arms looped around each other as if nothing could pull us apart. In those pictures, she was looking at me like I was part of her story. In the recent ones, she wasn't looking at me at all. It's funny how the eyes tell stories even when the lips don't. And hers told me something that night I hadn't wanted to hear. She wasn't mine anymore. Not in the way that mattered. I tried to convince myself that friendships change, that distance is natural, that people grow. But there's a difference between growing and outgrowing, and she had quietly done both. I thought about all the times I'd waited for her texts, the way I'd rehearse messages so they wouldn't sound too eager, too nostalgic, too much. I told myself that if I was patient, if I loved gently, she'd come back, that the version of her I missed would return. But that version only existed in memory now. She didn't do anything wrong, not really. That's what made it harder. There was no villain to blame, no moment to point at and say, this is where it ended. Just a quiet realization that she'd already stopped showing up long before I stopped waiting. One afternoon, I saw her across the street, laughing with a group of new faces, her eyes bright again. The same brightness she used to have with me, and I understood something I'd been too afraid to admit. She hadn't stopped laughing. She'd just stopped laughing with me. That night, I sat in my car longer than usual before going inside. The rain had started again, soft and rhythmic, tapping gently against the windshield. The sound felt familiar. The same rain we once danced under, now falling on two separate lives. I turned off the headlights and just listened. It's strange how grief doesn't always come with tears. Sometimes it's just silence, a weight that sits quietly in your chest. And that's what I felt. Not anger, not betrayal, just the ache of recognition. The realization that I'd become a memory in someone's life while they were still a part of mine. That's the kind of heartbreak that doesn't announce itself. It just lingers, soft and constant, like background noise you can't turn off. I stopped asking her to meet after that, stopped waiting for replies that came days later, stopped holding on to a version of us that no longer fit who we'd become. But even as I tried to let go, I found myself still checking my phone, still looking for signs of her. Love, even the platonic kind, doesn't end just because we decide it should. It fades in whispers, not in goodbyes. Sometimes I wonder if she ever noticed the difference, how my laughter had grown quieter, how my stories had become shorter, how my heart had begun to fold in on itself. Maybe she did. Maybe she just didn't know what to do with it. There's a strange grace in realizing someone doesn't need you anymore. Painful, but freeing. Because beneath the hurt there's truth, and truth, no matter how heavy, always brings you closer to peace. When I think of her now, I don't see betrayal. I see someone who walked beside me for as long as she could. Someone who helped me learn that not every connection is meant to stay. Some just teach us how deeply we can feel. And though her smile once hid the distance between us, I can finally see what it really meant. It wasn't pretending. It was her way of saying goodbye without breaking my heart out loud. Grief doesn't always start with death. Sometimes it begins in the softest ways. In unanswered messages. In the long pauses between words that used to flow so easily. That's how I lost her. Not in an ending, but in the empty space where our conversations used to live. Days turned into weeks without hearing from her. I told myself she was busy, that life had gotten loud, that people drift the way clouds do. But deep down I knew it wasn't about time. It was about care, and care, once it stops being mutual, becomes something you carry alone. There was a kind of ache that settled in the quiet moments, like waking up and realizing the world had moved on while you were still standing still. I'd open my phone, scroll through old chats, and find myself rereading sentences that no longer had warmth. Her words were still there, but the meaning had faded, like ink left too long in the sun. There was one message I never deleted. It said, "Promise me we'll always be this close." I must have read it 100 times, as if reading it could make it true again. But even promises lose their meaning when spoken by someone who no longer remembers them. Sometimes grief hides in routine. In making tea for two, even when you're alone. In waiting for a text you know won't come. In remembering how someone used to laugh, and realizing you can't recall the sound anymore. I tried to fill the silence with noise. New places, new faces, the hum of life moving forward. But nothing echoed the way her voice once did. Because real friendship isn't just about presence. It's about belonging. And once belonging leaves, everything else becomes background sound. The hardest part wasn't losing her. It was losing the version of myself that only existed when she was around. The girl who laughed easily, who believed in forever, who trusted without question. Without her, I felt like a half-finished story. One night, I went through the box of keepsakes we'd collected. Ticket stubs, notes, photographs with inside jokes scribbled on the back. They smelled faintly of dust and something older. Nostalgia, maybe. I traced her handwriting with my thumb and felt the weight of time pressing gently against my chest. There was one picture of us, taken years ago. We were sitting on the grass, sunlight in our hair, faces flushed from laughter. We looked like two people who believed nothing could touch us. I turned the photo over and saw her handwriting again. You and me, always. I think that's when I started crying. Not the kind that comes in waves, but the quiet kind. The kind that sneaks out while you're trying to stay composed. Because that's the thing about grief. It doesn't demand attention. It just waits patiently for the silence. For days after, I felt like a ghost in my own life, going through the motions, showing up, smiling on cue, all while something inside me kept whispering, "She's really gone." But the strangest part, she wasn't dead. She was still out there, living, laughing, sharing new memories, just not with me. And that's a kind of loss no one teaches you how to mourn. I wanted to hate her. I wanted to be angry, to have something sharp to hold on to. But anger requires energy, and I had none left. All I had was quiet acceptance and the ache of understanding. Sometimes I'd draft messages I never sent. I miss you. What happened to us? Did you even notice I stopped calling? But each time I'd delete them before hitting send. Because what could I possibly say that time hadn't already answered? The truth is, some endings are so quiet they don't even make a sound. They happen in glances, in changed priorities, in the small decisions that slowly erase what used to be sacred. I started noticing her absence everywhere. In the cafe where we used to sit for hours, in the streetlight that once guided us home after long talks, even in songs that had nothing to do with her. Somehow, everything did. It's strange how the world keeps spinning while you're grieving a version of it that no longer exists. I'd watch people pass by, talking, laughing, living, and wonder if they'd ever lost someone who was still alive. There's a loneliness in that kind of loss that feels infinite. Because you can't explain it. You can't hold a funeral for a friendship. You can't light a candle for something that's still breathing somewhere else. So, you just learn to live with the empty space. The one that used to be filled with a voice that knew you. Over time, the ache softened. It didn't vanish, but it learned to settle, like rainwater finding its level. I started remembering her without bitterness, though the memories still stung like an old wound touched by weather. Sometimes I'd catch myself smiling at something that reminded me of her. A phrase, a song, the way someone laughed. And then I'd feel it again, that bittersweet pull between love and loss. Because grief, I've learned, isn't the opposite of love. It's what remains when love has nowhere else to go. The night I deleted our chat history, I hesitated before pressing the button. It felt like erasing a piece of myself. But maybe that's what healing sometimes looks like. Letting go of the things that keep you waiting. I kept one photo, though. The first one we ever took together. Not because I couldn't move on, but because some memories deserve a place to rest. When I looked at that picture, I didn't see betrayal anymore. I saw two people who loved each other the best way they knew how, until they couldn't anymore, and maybe that's enough. Maybe not every story needs to end with anger or regret. Some just fade, quietly, leaving behind nothing but gratitude and a hollow kind of peace. That night, as I turned off the lights, I realized something simple yet profound. Silence doesn't always mean absence. Sometimes it's what's left when words have said all they can, and in that silence I finally stopped asking why. Because maybe there was never a reason, just a season. And that season, though gone, had still been beautiful once. Healing never arrived with thunder. It came quietly, like morning light sneaking through the curtains, touching the corners of a room that had long been dim. There was no grand moment of clarity, no tearful reconciliation, just silence, and somehow that silence began to feel kind. In the beginning it felt unbearable, the quiet after a friendship that once filled every corner of my life. But over time, that same quiet began to change its shape. It softened. It started to sound less like loss, and more like peace. I stopped checking my phone every few hours. Stopped walking past the cafe where we once sat. Stopped replaying every conversation in my head, searching for clues. It wasn't about forgetting her. It was about remembering myself. The version of me that existed before the waiting began. There's something sacred about learning how to sit alone without feeling lonely. For so long, I believed that silence was emptiness, that without her voice, without our laughter, something essential was missing. But now silence felt like space. Space to breathe, to grieve, to forgive. Space to understand that love doesn't always stay, but it always leaves something behind. I found myself walking again, through the same streets, the same park benches, the same little bookstore we once loved. Everything was the same, and yet nothing was, because this time, I wasn't seeing it through the lens of what used to be. I was seeing it as it was, as if the world had quietly rearranged itself while I wasn't looking. There's a strange beauty in revisiting old places once the pain has settled. The memories don't sting as sharply. They hum softly in the background, like a familiar melody. You can still feel the ghost of what was. But now, it feels like a gentle presence, not a wound. I remember standing outside that cafe again. The rain was falling just like before, tracing slow lines down the glass. But this time I didn't stop. I didn't look for her reflection, or wonder if she might walk in. I simply kept walking, and in that small act I realized something. Healing isn't always about forgetting. Sometimes it's about remembering differently. For the first time in a long while, I could think of her without flinching. Without bitterness, without that ache that used to twist inside me. I could simply wish her well, quietly, genuinely, knowing that our story had run its course. That we had both changed, and that change didn't make either of us villains. There's a softness that comes with acceptance. It doesn't erase the pain. It just makes room for gratitude to sit beside it. Gratitude for what was real, for the laughter, the comfort, the way her presence once made the world feel smaller, safer. Even if it didn't last forever, it was still something good. I used to think forgiveness meant letting someone back in. But I learned that sometimes it simply means setting them free, and setting yourself free too. Not with words, not with closure, but with quiet understanding. One afternoon, I found the friendship bracelet we'd made years ago, 2 thin strings tied together, colors faded but still knotted. I held it for a while, feeling the texture of it between my fingers. And then, gently, I placed it in a small wooden box with the photo I'd kept, not as an act of letting go, but of preservation, because even endings deserve to be remembered softly. There's something almost holy about realizing that peace doesn't come from getting answers. It comes from no longer needing them. For so long, I'd wanted to know what changed, what I did, what I missed, what moment shifted the course of us. But somewhere along the way, the question stopped mattering. The truth is, people grow. Sometimes they grow apart, and that isn't betrayal. It's life. I started noticing little signs of healing in the smallest things. The way I smiled at strangers, the way I laughed without guilt, the way I could hear an old song and not immediately think of her. Healing doesn't announce itself. It just quietly becomes who you are now. Sometimes I wonder if she ever thinks of me. If she ever scrolls past an old photo and feels that same tug in her chest. But even if she does, I don't need to know. Because knowing wouldn't change anything. Some people are meant to stay in your story only as echoes. Beautiful, distant, familiar. I've come to believe that distance isn't always a punishment. Sometimes it's a kindness. A way of protecting what was beautiful from turning into something bitter. Maybe silence, in its own way, is love's final act of care. There's a kind of grace in learning to hold joy and sorrow in the same hand, in realizing that missing someone doesn't mean you need them back, that you can love what was, and still move forward. That's what healing truly is. Not forgetting, but carrying gently. Now, when it rains, I no longer feel the weight of memory pressing down on me. I watch the drops fall, soft and steady, and feel something close to gratitude, because that rain, the same rain that once blurred my reflection, now feels cleansing. Like a quiet reminder that even after the hardest storms, life continues to bloom. One evening, I sat by my window with a cup of tea and thought of all the people who had come and gone from my life. And for the first time, I didn't feel loss. I felt fullness, because every person, every love, every friendship, even the ones that didn't last, had shaped the person I had become. And maybe that was the point all along, so I whispered a small thank you into the quiet. Not to her exactly, but to the memory of us, to the years we shared, the laughter that once filled the air, the lessons wrapped in love and pain. Thank you for teaching me that silence doesn't have to mean the end. Sometimes it's the beginning of understanding, and as I watched the rain fade into mist, I realized the ache was gone. Not because time had erased it, but because my heart had learned to make peace with it. The story hadn't ended cruelly. It had simply completed its purpose. Silence had become my way of saying goodbye, and also my way of loving what remained. I wrote it one night when the world was asleep. No candles, no music, no ceremony. Just me, a dim lamp, and the kind of silence that holds both sorrow and peace. I didn't plan to write it. The words simply arrived. Slow, hesitant, but honest. The letter wasn't meant for anyone else. Not for her. Not for the people who had come and gone. It was for me. For the girl I used to be before I learned how easily love can turn into loss. I started with her name, the one only I used to whisper to myself in moments of comfort. Then I wrote, "I forgive you." Those 3 words felt heavier than I expected. Heavier than any apology I had ever given or received. Because forgiveness, I've learned, isn't about letting someone else off the hook. It's about freeing yourself from the version of you that couldn't move on. I forgave her for trusting too easily. For loving without boundaries. For thinking that forever meant forever. For staying quiet when she should have spoken, and for speaking when silence would have been kinder. I forgave her for replaying every moment. For chasing closure in empty echoes. For mistaking absence for punishment. I forgave her for holding on long after her hands had begun to bleed, and then I thanked her, because even through the mistakes she loved with a kind of courage that not everyone dares to show. She gave her heart fully, without a map, without armor. And yes, she got hurt. But that hurt became proof of how deeply she was capable of feeling. I told her that she wasn't naive for believing in people. That her softness wasn't a weakness, it was her greatest strength. That it takes bravery to care in a world that teaches us to protect, to guard, to expect disappointment. As I wrote, tears didn't fall. It wasn't that kind of release. It was quieter, like the soft sigh that comes when you finally understand something. "You've been fighting for too long," I wrote, about the morning she woke up, heavy with loneliness but still showed up for the world anyway, about the nights she pressed her hands against her chest, trying to steady a heart that wouldn't stop remembering, about the moments she thought she'd never laugh the same way again, but did, months later, without realizing it. I told her she didn't lose anything that was meant for her, that every person who walked away carved space for something gentler to enter, that every heartbreak taught her how to love herself a little more honestly, and then I told her something I never thought I could. You did enough. Because for so long, she believed she was the reason things ended, that she was too much, or not enough, or simply wrong in ways she could never fix. But she wasn't broken. She was just growing. And growth rarely looks graceful. I wrote until my hand ached, until the ink smudged, until the words became more feeling than language. The letter wasn't perfect, it wasn't meant to be. It was raw, uneven, full of pauses and spaces, but in every word there was truth. When I finished, I folded it carefully. I didn't read it twice. I didn't seal it or tuck it away. I simply placed it on my bedside table, next to the glass of water and the lamp, and let it rest there. For the first time in years, I slept without dreams. And in the morning, the light through the window felt softer, as if the world itself had exhaled. I didn't need to keep the letter. Its purpose wasn't to be remembered, but to be released. So later that day, I watched as the paper curled and turned to ash in a small bowl by the window. The smoke rose slowly, twisting into the air like a prayer. A quiet goodbye to the girl who once carried too much. But even as the ashes settled, I knew she wasn't gone. She was still here, in the way I smiled more easily now, in the peace I felt when I walked alone, in the small, steady warmth of my own company. She hadn't disappeared. She had simply evolved, and maybe that's what healing truly is. Not erasing who you were, but integrating her into who you are becoming. I realized then that I no longer wanted to return to the person I was before the heartbreak. Because that version of me hadn't yet learned what it meant to survive herself. Now I did, and that kind of strength can only be born through loss. So I whispered to her, to the girl in the ashes, to the echo in the quiet. Thank you for walking me this far. I'll take it from here. And as I stepped outside, the air felt new. The world hadn't changed, but I had. The trees swayed the same way they always had. The sky stretched endlessly above me. And yet, it all looked clearer, softer. Maybe that's what happens when you stop carrying the weight of who you were supposed to be. You start seeing beauty not as something to chase, but as something you finally allow yourself to feel. And in that moment, standing there in the stillness of an ordinary morning, I realized this was peace. Not the loud, triumphant kind that makes for grand endings, but the quiet, humble kind that grows slowly, gently within you, the kind that doesn't need to be announced, the kind that simply, is it strange how silence can sound like memory? Sometimes, when the evening settles just right, when the wind brushes through the curtains and the house exhales, I can still hear echoes of laughter that no longer belong here. Not loud, not haunting, just familiar, like an old song that lingers long after it ends. For a long time I thought healing meant forgetting. That to move on I had to erase every trace, the photos, the inside jokes, the street corners that still whispered her name. But I was wrong. Healing wasn't about erasing. It was about learning how to live alongside what once hurt, and realizing that the ache could coexist with peace. Sometimes I still think of her. Not with anger, not even with sadness, just with quiet understanding. She was a chapter, not the whole story. And even if that chapter ended with a comma instead of a period, it was still beautiful while it lasted. There are days when I find myself smiling at things only she would understand. A half-burnt candle scent, a certain melody on the radio, the color of the sky before rain. Those small, unspoken reminders don't sting anymore. They've softened, like edges worn down by time and tenderness. Because maybe love, in all its forms, isn't meant to be owned or kept. Maybe it's meant to move through us, to teach us, to shape us, and then to move on, leaving behind just enough warmth to remind us we once felt deeply. I used to think the hardest part of losing someone was the emptiness that followed, but now I see. The hardest part is learning how to fill that emptiness without trying to replace them. To find meaning not in what's gone, but in what remains. And what remains, surprisingly, is love. Not the kind that clings, but the kind that lingers softly. In the way I show up for others. In the patience I now carry. In the gentleness I offer to myself. One evening, I returned to that same cafe where everything quietly began to fall apart. The same rain tapping against the glass. The same corner seat by the window. But this time it felt different. Not heavier, lighter, like the air had finally cleared. I ordered tea again, the same kind as before. But instead of staring at the rain, I watched the world move. Strangers laughing, a couple sharing an umbrella, a mother brushing crumbs from her child's face. And in that ordinary moment, I realized I no longer lived in the story of what I'd lost. I lived in the story of what I'd learned. I'd learned that some relationships end not because they failed, but because they completed their purpose. That love doesn't need to last forever to be real. That even endings can be acts of grace. She and I, we don't talk anymore. And maybe that's okay. Not every connection is meant to continue. Some are meant to leave fingerprints, not footprints. I carry those fingerprints still. Not as scars, but as reminders. Reminders that I once cared deeply. That I once gave my all. That I once believed in forever. And that belief, even if it broke me, made me kinder. Sometimes, when the light hits the old photograph on my shelf, I see us, young, unguarded, laughing like the world was endless. And for a brief moment, it feels like no time has passed. Then the feeling fades, replaced not by sorrow, but by gratitude. Because how lucky was I to have known that kind of closeness at all? Gratitude, that's what remains when everything else settles. Gratitude for what was, for what is, and even for what never will be. As I gather my things to leave the cafe, the rain outside has stopped. The streets glisten, washed clean, and as I step into the soft evening air, I realize I no longer look back to see who's following. The story we shared has ended, yes, but the lesson it left behind still walks beside me. And maybe that's enough. When I reach home, I make a cup of tea and sit by the window again. The same chair, the same cup, but not the same heart. I watch the clouds drift, slow and forgiving, and I whisper softly. To her, to me, to everything we were. Thank you. The house is quiet now. But it's not empty. It's full. Of echoes, of memories, of love that no longer hurts. and as I take a slow sip of tea, I realize this stillness, this quiet, isn't loneliness. It's peace.